Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It was a very moving talk we've just had. I feel quite affected by it. And about the contributions that people have made already. Oh, is that better? Well, I'm a psychotherapist. I expect several of you are here, or counsellor. I've been such for 30 years, and for that time I've been very concerned about the underrepresentation of BME communities within the psychotherapy profession. Obviously, as we've heard, not underrepresented amongst patients and clients. But while there's been some improvement, there's not been as much of an underrepresentation in mental health professions more generally. It has led me to explore this issue in my PhD research, which I was awarded 10 years ago. During that time, and since then, I've worked extensively with BME communities, mostly but not exclusively, with asylum seekers and refugees. That's in Bristol. In telling you that, I'm setting out my stall as someone who's given this some thought. I understand that it is something that concerns everyone here. For myself, I can only talk to you as someone who is white, and my research deepened my insight into what it is to be white within a multicultural setting. Since then, I wrote the book called Being White in the Helping Professions, which was based on my research. The experience of doing that was extremely salutary, and I would like to tell you something of my experience and the lessons that I learnt. I have, by the way, bought some of my books, and they are some copies of my book, and they are on the table at the back if anyone wants to buy one. But to go back to my research, my initial research question was, why are so few black psychotherapists entering the profession? And why do so few people from BME communities undertake psychotherapy? I had various other questions, such as, is psychotherapy a suitable endeavor for those who are not from the Western world? And how can white people better understand those from BME backgrounds? In exploring this more closely, and by being encouraged to look from my own standpoint within this field of inquiry, I decided to turn the whole thing on its head, so that the object of my research became myself and my whiteness and other white people. This led me to an engrossing inquiry in which I learned a lot about myself as well as about the work. It was also far more effective in helping me to work within a multicultural context than trying harder and harder to understand the world from the standpoint of black people. This does not mean to say that that doesn't have value, but maybe surprisingly is less effective in making a difference to my work. My research question therefore changed to, what does it mean to be white? Defining whiteness was also a problem, and I decided that for the purposes of my research, it was the Western European diaspora, in other words, people who originated in Western Europe and have dispersed to other parts of the world, particularly, but not exclusively, to America, Australia, Canada, and South Africa. How people define themselves in terms of blackness and whiteness is also of interest, but is beyond the scope of this talk. It is nevertheless true to say that white people, given this definition, are especially privileged in a way that I will show. By thus acknowledging my own race, I could see that we live within a culture which has been racialized. In other words, one in which groups of people are considered to be of different races. This racialization is therefore also to be found as part and parcel of the counseling and psychotherapy professions. Most professional members of psychotherapy organizations, including students, teaching staff, and clients, are white. So something about the snowy white peaks. Yes, it can be seen there. This whiteness is reinforced by our mainstream theories as on the whole, they do not attend to diverse cultural differences and experiences. Their perspective is inevitably a white one. Moreover, psychotherapy theorizing, both about the psychology of individuals and about practice, make assumptions based on white Western attitudes and values. A significant initial discovery was the way in which I found it hard to focus on whiteness at all. It seemed like looking at nothingness. I discovered that sociologists who write in the area of white studies had found the same phenomenon. And so I decided to find out more about the quality of whiteness. Questions arose such as, who am I as a white person? What is the nature of my privilege as a white person? How does being white affect my ability to relate to those who are not? What is the nature of race? And who am I in a racialized environment? So what emerges in the space between a black person and a white person when they meet? Here are some of the sorts of things that may emerge. Memories of racialized events, such as racial abuse, prejudiced decisions and hurtful rejections, a long history of privilege and deprivation, depictions of black and white people in fiction, in pictures, and in history as taught in British schools, feelings of shame, ideas picked up maybe from the press about different countries, including stereotyped ideas, etc., etc. My husband, who has the surname Hawkins, was introduced to a West Indian director of an addiction centre. He acknowledged this by saying, Hawkins, an interesting name. John Hawkins was the pioneer of British slave trading, and his ghosts still appear in a meeting between black and white people. Many slaves were given this name, losing their own name forever. Discovering that white people see themselves as normal seems to be a major finding of those who research whiteness in the sociological discipline of white studies. Researchers find that whites regard others as having a race, whilst white people are just the human ordinary. A professor of film studies at Warwick University wrote a book entitled White, which begins with the sentence, "There is nothing more powerful than being just human. Nothing further needs to be asserted or explained or thought about. This brings about a habit of thought which makes reflecting on whiteness very difficult." In my book, Being White in the Helping Professions, I describe how I found that focusing on being white feels like being magnetized strongly to a position which I can certainly pull away from, but to which I inevitably get drawn back. The most I can say after engaging with this for many years is that magnet is a little weaker than it used to be. I have found that when I talk to white people, they often object to this and point out that any group tends to think of itself as the normal one, that it's human nature to do so. No doubt there is some truth in this, but when the apparent normality of white people is put together with the cultural power they have in contemporary society, as well as over the centuries, then we are talking about a much more insidious phenomenon than the tendency of groups to be insular. Black people are less likely to see their groups as self-evidently normal or ordinary in the same way. If your group or culture have been described as other, both implicitly and explicitly, for so long by a more powerful group, then it is not hard to think of yourself as other as well, unless on reflection you want to angrily assert your own normality. If you're not sure you agree with this, think of these points. Firstly, can apparently white people be white if they have a black blood relative or ancestor? Those of mixed race, so-called, are considered by white people to be black, even if that black person was their grandparent or great-grandparent, particularly if this blackness shows in their features, skin color, or hair. If they happen to look white, then they just pass as white. The blackness in them makes them other. Secondly, when thinking of courses or workshops about cultural matters, do you expect, if you're a white person, to be considering your own race? I find that you are more likely to think you'll be learning about black people and their needs, White values and tenets tend to be taken as the benchmark from which other approaches to life are measured, even if, as enlightened people, we can see that other cultures have value. So what kind of privilege does being white give white people? When Obama won the presidency of America, I wondered for a moment if white people were losing their privileged status. Certainly, if a majority of Americans can vote for a black man, then something must be happening, though we have now seen a huge backlash. Since then, the phenomena of Islamophobia has arisen and is getting worse, particularly with the present refugee crisis. This has served to bring out pre-existing fears of being overwhelmed with non-white people. Nearly 30 years ago, a white American researcher called McIntosh, maybe some of you know her, found 46 different ways in which she felt she was privileged by being white, most of which still apply. These demonstrate the easy, taken-for-granted way white people can negotiate life and expect to be accepted, valued, and serviced. Here are a few of those she listed. I have no difficulty finding neighborhoods where people approve of our household. I will feel welcome and normal in the usual walks of public life, institutional and social. When I'm told about our national heritage or civilization, I'm shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can talk with my mouth full and not have this put down to my color. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. I can be late for a meeting without that lateness reflecting on my race. Maybe since Obama's election as the President of the USA, we could now add to the list, I can become President of the United States without being thought a credit to my race. So being white apparently makes us normal and therefore privileged. And this privilege, along with great wealth and originally founded on colonization, has given whites power. This power provides them with the ability to develop and use very sophisticated technology, including those that have military ends, and live within an environment which ensures that their cultural artifacts, such as political and financial systems, languages, modes of dress, religion, music, and other artistic endeavors, have predominance worldwide. On the other hand, it is very common for white people to experience painful feelings of shame and guilt about their privilege. I've indeed found in myself deep feelings of guilt and shame about my own complicity in white privilege, and in my research found that I was by no means alone in this. In a research group which was made up of white people, which set out to explore these issues, we found that our own culpability for racism was not just about our own racist attitudes, but the way we still benefit by racist policies of the past. One way of trying to combat the problems that arise from the disadvantages which accrue from racism is to form community organizations which support minority groups. We have several such in Bristol to help refugee communities. It is likely to be generally true that where there are white people within these organizations, they are the helpers rather than the helped. This immediately reveals a power imbalance within our society. However well-intentioned those white people are, they have the power to be helpful rather than being ostensibly in need of help. In my experience, white people who work in community organizations are the sort of people who feel guilty about their white privilege and want to do something about it. Many are admirable people who are very genuine in their desire to create a more equal society. No doubt there are several such people here. I certainly do not want to belittle or take issue with the authenticity of such a desire. What I am suggesting is that we as white people allow ourselves to think about the impact of our whiteness within a multicultural setting, and not allow race issues to be the province of non-white people alone. The impact of our whiteness isn't only or even mainly about us as individuals. It is also about the wider context of the cultural and societal milieu in which we and our organizations are embedded. Whatever we do, our history is always present with us and can need acknowledgement, even if it is not if it is not to be like a troublesome, uninvited guest at the party. Whites and non-whites alike bring all their relationships, their personal stories and histories, including family and cultural ones. The controversial but rich mixture that these histories bring forms the context in which the meetings in each organisation occur and shapes and authors the stories we make together. In this context, race, particularly the contribution of the white race, is often silent and not reflected upon. I myself work as a therapist, and an experience I have had recently is a good illustration of what I'm talking about and could be relevant in any setting. I have a Muslim client who was brought up in Africa, but since late adolescence has been living, working, and receiving education in the West. She had apparently taken on white values and customs in a seamless way. At the time, I remembering she was very pressured with work and study, and had several deadlines to meet. Whilst this was happening, her sister announced that she intended to come and stay. My client complained to me about the amount of time this would consume at such a difficult time, and we started to look at how she might communicate this difficulty to her sister, who would normally expect constant, undivided attention when visiting. I felt dismayed at the pressure that this would put my client under. On having this thought, I reflected that her sister's expectations were culturally based as well, and that my client would have had, at least originally, the same cultural norm. Mine was very different. My own sister would not have insisted on coming to stay at a difficult time, and I would have no problem in explaining to her in a way that would not cause offense. I reflected to her, my client, that maybe she herself was taking on a very Western attitude in putting her own needs first, and crucially, I wondered if she was doing that for my sake. This comment opened up a whole area of our relationship in which we had evidently combined to stress her Western side and downplayed the part of her that would normally drop everything to attend to a family member. In exploring this, it became evident that for her, family was always paramount, and she had kept that from me, knowing or expecting that I would not be able to understand or appreciate this value. The extent to which she had hidden from me shocked me, as I had regarded our relationship as intimate and open. Her Western and non-Western sides had been held apart to survive in Britain, including, it seemed, in her therapy. So how can white mental health professionals, many of whom are at the sharp end of these problems, be more aware of issues which arise from their whiteness? One way is to become more aware of unbidden and possibly unconscious responsibles to those who are not white, the sensations, emotions, feelings, thoughts, fantasies, dreams, etc. that arise with them when they meet non-white people and can insidiously affect their relationships. Many people, particularly those who do not regard themselves as racist, don't allow these responses into their minds, as they can be extremely non-politically correct, rather shaming, and seem to run counter to their core values. This can be very painful to do, and it's no wonder we want to hide these responses. In my research, I found that very well-intentioned people had very racist thoughts if they didn't push them away. However, we also found that if these were allowed and acknowledged, and therefore possible to reflect on, they were less likely to subtly drive our actions and could lead to more authentic relationships. Guilt and shame tend to be behind quite a lot of inauthentic responses for white people within a multicultural really address the issues of inequality, both in our lives in general and in our work. We may also not want to be accused of this and be at pains not to appear to be at fault. In trying to hide our guilt, we as white people may try various strategies. We might, for instance, try to show how nice we are. For instance, a white therapist called Lynn Jacobs wrote a paper called For Whites Only. In it, she recognized that she tends to want to be the nice therapist who is not like the rest. So maybe to stave off guilt and accusations of not being able to understand those with whom she we work, we do what we can to show how sympathetic we can be. But in doing so, we may find that we are, in fact, chasing our own agendas to be considered nice and avoid painful confrontation. I can certainly identify with this, and maybe some people can here, any white people here may recognize that. Related to that is an avoidance of any negative messages that the black people we work with may want to give us, just picking up on the positive ones. This can insidiously encourage black people to express only positive feelings, such as gratitude and admiration. This will, of course, apply to the clients and service users that we work with, but we could also apply to our work with our colleagues. Colleagues often have differences, but these can seem more risky and sensitive when they come up between white and non-white people, so are often avoided. So, in conclusion, it's very important for white people to understand that they have a race, and that this race tends to be the most privileged within a racialized field. So privileged that white people can afford to ignore the issue of their own race completely. From this beneficial position, white people have described and categorized the racial environment, whilst absenting themselves from it. Once that is taken on board, it is important for white people to understand and acknowledge the impact they have in a racialized environment. When I started my research at the University of Bath, many people said I had no business in the area of race awareness, as I was white. I now think that white people, in particular, need to address these issues, and that a change in white consciousness is at the heart of what is needed in the field.
We haven't got, thank you, Dr. Judy, and I never thought I'd be at a conference where we talked about these issues openly. If you look at the American literature, and I ask all of you who are interested in this country, and Dr. Judy mentioned it once, white privilege. In America and in the American literature, they talk about white power and the impact of white power, whiteification on communities. And I know these are uncomfortable subjects and uncomfortable topics, but the impact of privilege on communities is huge, and it's deep, and there's an evidence base. This is not something which we're just saying because we've got a chip on our shoulder. This is something where there is a very, very strong evidence base that underpins the role of white privilege and the impact that it has on communities. These are very, very serious issues. Dr. Carlis.
Yeah, thank you very much, Judy. As Malik said, daring to talk about things that are actually quite hard, sometimes even to acknowledge things that are hard to see. We're talking about dynamics between people. And we as a society are not terribly good at actually dealing with the things that are invisible. The things we tend to be able to deal with the visible. And yet, quite often, our relationships are determined by these invisible things. So thank you so much for daring to do the research, and also for daring to come here and talk to us about it. Okay. Now,
Dr. Carlis, can I just say before you go on, I'm just picking up not a tweet, but a text, and I won't mention the person who texted, but it says, it's interesting for Dr. Judy as a white person coming speaking to an audience that is predominantly black. What we need is for this conversation to be had to an audience that is predominantly white. And how far will people like David and others go to have these conversations inside these hideously white organizations? That's the real Rubicon that we need to cross.
okay.
Yeah, I'd like to say how true that is, and how difficult it is to get to talk to a group of white people about it, to have this, to be asked to come to a group of white people to talk about this. It doesn't happen very often. Much more often that I'm asked to talk to a group of black people.
Okay.
David, we're pointing at you for a future conversation inside the trust. And I know that you will.
Okay, well, how about being put on the hot seat anyway? We have time really just for about 2 questions. Unfortunately, we're running so far behind. And this is a big issue. We had the previous one was a big issue. So these are 2 big issues that really need much more time. They need time on their own. So 2 questions. Anybody has a question for? Okay.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, and the last speaker, very courageous, really. I mean, combining Dr. Arnold's speech and yours, and with today's really theme within mental health, then, and the inequalities that exist, everyone acknowledges, and that has been written about and talked about since probably the 60s or the 70s. Why is it not these issues taken seriously, one, by governments or nationally, to locally by institutions and organizations, in terms of changing practice, which is whatever the reason of overrepresentation and inequalities, that may be debatable and there may be multiple factors, but in terms of dealing with it, I mean, why is it not all these things, attachment and separation, attachment and loss, and then whiteness and privilege and discrimination and racism and institutional discrimination is not taken seriously for the last 20, 30 years, which we have been talking about, but as it has been mentioned earlier, in terms of change, there is very, very little change in terms of addressing that inequality or still exists. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it is completely outrageous that it hasn't been more addressed. But I think one of the things, well, I think there are various reasons, but I think one is the difficulty that people have in thinking systemically, that they just see individuals, and they also see things in terms of people's individual pathologies or something, rather than seeing that there's a dynamic within the country that has thrown up this, and it's very, very hard to shift, and it really needs addressing. And of course, people don't like to be accused of anything, you know. I mean, how many people say, I'm not racist if they're white? I'm not racist, but, is one of the things, isn't it? I mean, in fact, every white person needs to acknowledge that they are racist. When I did my research, and I interviewed white people, all of them owned to the fact that they have racist thoughts which they kind of bat away, you know, like a little racist thought comes out. So I devised a way of getting white people to congratulate themselves for catching a racist thought. You see what I mean? So that to encourage it, so that it can be looked at and worked with and acknowledged, rather than it's too shameful to have that thought, I'm not going to let it arise. Because, I mean, a lot of the problem is not just with out and out racists, but just common or, ordinary people who are reasonably well-meaning, I suppose, or think they are. That's their self-image.
Okay, question here. Final question, I think.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is in regards to white privilege within the educational system, and whether white privilege can actually affect how children behave in the class, and also the fact that you have an overrepresentation of black children being sent into PRUs, where after that they go into criminal system and then prison. Is there a link there?
Well, I wouldn't say I was an expert on that, but I imagine the same sorts of things apply in that situation. It's so sad, isn't it? And horrific, really, that that's the situation. So much needs addressing. and it's been around for so long. What can I say? What more can I say?
Thank you, Dr. Judy. Can I just say, can a round of applause for Dr. Judy, please? Yeah.